My golden boy brother's fiancée framed me for nothing, and my mom and dad chose her over me. Years later, I became a millionaire. That fool is behind bars, and my parents are on their knees begging me for cash. Sup Reddit, my name is Blake, and I'm 26 years old now. This is going to be a long story, but I really need to get this off my chest. What happened to me a few years back still keeps me up some nights, tossing and turning as I replay the events in my mind. After seeing some similar posts on here recently, I figured that maybe sharing my story might help someone else who's going through the same nightmare I experienced. This whole mess started when I was 23 years old. My younger brother Dylan, who was 21 at the time, and I both ended up working at this mid-sized marketing company called Apex Marketing Solutions. We had both gotten hired shortly after we graduated from college. It wasn't exactly planned that way. Neither of us intended to work at the same place. But the job market was absolutely terrible back then, and they happened to be hiring when we were both desperately looking for work. Now, here's some important context about me and Dylan that you need to understand. We never really got along growing up, and I mean that in the truest sense. It wasn't that we hated each other or anything dramatic like that, but we were just fundamentally different people with completely different personalities and approaches to life. He was always what you'd call the golden child in my parents' eyes. You know those families where one kid can literally burn the house down and somehow it ends up being the neighbor's fault? That was Dylan in our household. He could do no wrong, while I was always held to a much higher standard. So anyway, we're both working at this company and doing our best to stay out of each other's way professionally. The arrangement was actually working out pretty well. We kept our interactions minimal and professional, and there was no family drama spilling over into the workplace. It was a relief, honestly, because I'd been worried about how awkward it might be working in the same building as my brother. Everything was going smoothly until Dylan started dating this girl from the Human Resources department. Her name was Victoria. She was 22 years old, and she was exactly the type of girl Dylan always seemed to gravitate toward. She was attractive, outgoing, and seemed to have that bubbly personality that people in HR often possess. Everyone at the company seemed to genuinely like her, and she appeared to be well respected in her department. At first, I barely interacted with Victoria beyond the usual workplace pleasantries that you'd expect between colleagues. Our conversations were limited to brief exchanges like, "Hey Blake, how's your day going?" Followed by my standard response of, "Good, thanks." It was all very basic, professional small talk that didn't extend beyond what was necessary for a functional workplace relationship. She seemed nice enough from what I could observe, and I was genuinely happy for Dylan. The guy had finally found someone who wasn't completely insane, which was honestly a relief. His track record with girlfriends during college had been absolutely rough. A series of dramatic relationships with women who seemed to thrive on chaos and emotional instability. Victoria appeared to be a welcome change from that pattern. But after they had been dating for maybe 6 weeks, I started noticing some weird behavior that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Nothing major at first, just little things that seemed slightly off and made me question whether I was reading too much into innocent interactions. The first thing I noticed was during our monthly all-hands meetings. These were company-wide gatherings where management would update everyone on quarterly results, new initiatives, and general business updates. During these meetings, I started catching Victoria staring at me from across the room. And I'm not talking about quick glances or accidental eye contact that you might have with any coworker. This was full-on, intense staring that would last way too long to be considered normal or coincidental. When I would notice her looking and turn to make eye contact back, she would immediately smile at me in this almost flirtatious way and then look away. But it was happening far too often during these meetings for it to be accidental. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of her presence in the room and feeling increasingly uncomfortable about these prolonged stares. It was the kind of attention that made me shift in my seat and wonder if other people were noticing what was happening. Then there were the encounters in the break room, which became even more concerning. Our office had this small kitchen area with an espresso machine that was basically the social hub of the entire company. It was where people would gather to chat, grab coffee, and take breaks from their work. Normal workplace stuff, but I began noticing that Victoria would always seem to mysteriously show up whenever I was there getting coffee or heating up my lunch. At first, she would make what seemed like innocent small talk about work-related topics. She'd ask about projects I was working on, comment on recent company announcements, or discuss upcoming deadlines. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, she began shifting these conversations toward more personal questions that had nothing to do with our professional relationship. She started asking things like, How do you like living in Brickell? And what gym do you go to? And any fun plans for this weekend? These questions felt increasingly inappropriate coming from my brother's girlfriend, especially given the context of her strange staring behavior during meetings. The conversations always felt like they had an underlying agenda that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but definitely made me uncomfortable. But perhaps the worst part of these interactions were the compliments she would give me. She'd say things like, "You're so dedicated. I see you staying late all the time," or "Dylan's really lucky to have such a hardworking brother." While these might sound innocent on the surface, the way she delivered them felt loaded with some kind of underlying meaning that I was supposed to pick up on. Her tone and body language suggested these weren't just casual observations about my work ethic, but something more suggestive. I made a conscious effort to keep all of our interactions as professional and brief as possible. When she would ask personal questions, I'd give short, non-committal answers and immediately try to change the subject back to work-related topics. I figured that maybe she was just being overly friendly in that HR way that some people have, and that I was probably reading too much into innocent workplace interactions. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid and that her behavior would normalize once she got more comfortable in the office environment. Unfortunately, I was completely wrong about that assumption, and things were about to escalate in a way that I never could have anticipated. What happened next would change everything and set in motion a series of events that would destroy my life as I knew it. I tried my best to keep things professional and brief whenever Victoria approached me. When she would ask those increasingly personal questions, I made sure to give short, non-committal answers and immediately redirect the conversation back to work-related topics. I figured that maybe she was just being friendly in that overly enthusiastic way that some HR people have, and that I was probably reading too much into what might have been innocent workplace interactions. I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, and that her behavior would eventually normalize once she settled into the office dynamics. But then the text messages started, and that's when I knew for certain that my instincts had been right all along. It was a Tuesday night around 10:30 p.m., and I was at home having a completely normal evening. I was sprawled out on my couch watching Netflix and eating leftover Chinese takeout from the night before. Just a typical weeknight routine after a long day at the office. I was completely relaxed and not thinking about work or office drama at all when my phone suddenly buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. The message read, "Hey Blake, it's Victoria. Got your number from the company directory. Hope that's okay." I stared at the message on my phone screen for what felt like a full minute, completely confused about what was happening. Why would Dylan's girlfriend be texting me directly? And why was she doing it at 10:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night? The company directory explanation was also really weird to me. While it was true that HR definitely had access to everyone's contact information, using it for personal messages seemed like it was probably against company policy, if not completely inappropriate. I decided to text back with a simple, "Hey, what's up?" because I was thinking that maybe there was some kind of work emergency or urgent situation that required immediate attention. Maybe there was a last-minute schedule change or some kind of HR issue that needed to be addressed quickly. I couldn't think of any other reasonable explanation for why she would be contacting me this late in the evening. Her response came back immediately, and when I read it, I felt my blood run cold. She wrote, "I've been wanting to tell you something for a while. I really like you, like more than just friends. I know this is probably weird, but I had to say it." I literally said, "What the hell?" out loud to my empty apartment. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This woman was actively dating my brother, and here she was texting me at 10:30 p.m. to confess romantic feelings. What kind of person does something like that? It was beyond inappropriate. It was a complete betrayal of Dylan and a massive violation of basic relationship boundaries. I immediately typed back, "Victoria, you're in a relationship with my brother. How could you even say this to me?" But instead of apologizing or backing down, she started trying to justify her behavior, though she wasn't really offering any genuine apology for what she had just done. Her next message read, "I know it's complicated, but I can't help how I feel. Maybe we could just grab coffee sometime to talk about it?" She kept pushing the conversation as if I was going to be flattered by her proposition. She was essentially asking me to help her cheat on my own brother, and she seemed to expect that I would be receptive to the idea. The audacity was absolutely mind-blowing to me. I shut that conversation down as hard as I possibly could. I texted back, "No way. This conversation never happened. Don't text me about this again." She responded with a simple "okay," and that was the end of the exchange. I thought that maybe she had finally gotten the message and would back off completely. I hoped that she would keep things professional at work, and we could all just pretend that this incredibly awkward and inappropriate moment had never happened. I was trying to be the bigger person and not cause unnecessary drama in what was already a complicated situation with family and work dynamics involved. Looking back now, I realize that was the biggest mistake of my life. I should have immediately taken screenshots of those messages. I should have told Dylan right away what his girlfriend was doing behind his back. I should have reported her to HR for inappropriate contact and potential harassment. But instead, I was trying to handle the situation maturely and avoid creating family drama. Because just 2 days later, my entire world came crashing down around me in the most devastating way imaginable. So it was Thursday afternoon, and I was at work trying my best to focus on this quarterly campaign analysis that was due first thing Monday morning. It was a complex project that required deep concentration, but I kept finding myself distracted and glancing over toward the HR section of the office. I couldn't stop wondering if Victoria was going to try to approach me again after that completely inappropriate text exchange we'd had 2 nights earlier, or if she had actually gotten the hint from my firm rejection and would leave me alone from now on. From what I could observe, she seemed to be keeping her distance, which I thought was a promising sign. She wasn't making any attempts to engage me in conversation during my coffee breaks, and she hadn't tried to catch my eye during any meetings. I was cautiously optimistic that maybe she had realized how inappropriate her behavior had been and decided to respect the boundaries I had established. Around 3:30 p.m., my phone started ringing, and when I looked at the caller ID, I saw it was my mom. This immediately struck me as very strange because she never ever called me during work hours unless something was seriously wrong with the family. Like, the only time I could remember her calling me at work before this was when my grandfather had suffered his stroke a few years earlier. So seeing her name on my phone in the middle of a workday afternoon immediately filled me with dread. "Blake, you need to come over to the house right now," she said the moment I answered. Her voice sounded completely different than normal, all serious and strained in a way that made my stomach drop. "What's wrong? Is Dad okay?" I asked, immediately thinking that someone must be in the hospital or that there had been some kind of accident or medical emergency. Just come over. We need to talk to you about something important," she replied, but she wouldn't give me any additional details no matter how much I pressed her for information. I tried to get more specifics about what was happening, but she wouldn't say anything else over the phone. She just kept insisting that I needed to come over to their house immediately, and her tone was becoming increasingly urgent and distressed. The whole conversation was making me incredibly anxious because this was completely out of character for my mother. My manager was completely understanding about letting me leave early, especially since it clearly seemed like some kind of family emergency was unfolding. I explained that my mother had called and needed me to come home immediately, and he told me to take care of whatever I needed to take care of and not to worry about work. The drive to my parents' house felt like it took forever, even though it's really only about 30 minutes from downtown Miami where our office was located. The entire time I was driving, I kept running through all the possible scenarios in my head, trying to figure out what could be so urgent and serious that my mom would call me out of work. Someone had died. Someone was seriously sick. Maybe my parents were getting divorced. Maybe there was some kind of major financial crisis happening with the family. Never in a million years would I have guessed what was actually waiting for me when I arrived at their house. The reality was so much worse than anything I could have possibly imagined during that long, anxious drive across the city. When I pulled into their driveway, I immediately noticed that Dylan's car was already there, which struck me as odd since he usually worked until around 7 p.m., and it was only about 4:15 in the afternoon. The fact that he had also left work early suggested that whatever this family meeting was about, it was serious enough to warrant both of us being called away from our jobs. The front door was unlocked, so I walked in and called out, "Hello!" as I came through the entryway, just like I had done countless times throughout my childhood and teenage years. "In here." My dad's voice came from the living room, and there was something in his tone that I had never heard before. Something cold and distant that immediately put me on edge. I walked into the living room, and the scene that greeted me was immediately and obviously wrong in every possible way. Both of my parents were sitting rigidly on the couch, looking more grim and serious than I had ever seen them in my entire life. They looked like someone had just told them that their house was being foreclosed on or that they had lost their life savings in some kind of financial scam. And there, sitting on the opposite couch, was Victoria, and she was absolutely losing her mind crying. I'm talking about the kind of hysterical, ugly crying that you see in movies during tragic scenes. Her face was red and puffy, Mascara was running down her cheeks, and she was clutching a tissue box like her life depended on it. "Sit down," my dad said, pointing to the chair across from where they were all positioned. His voice was completely devoid of warmth or familiarity, like he was talking to a stranger rather than his own son. "What's going on?" I asked, looking between all of them and trying to make sense of this surreal scene. "Is everyone okay?" That's when my mom spoke up, and what she said made my blood freeze in my veins. "We need you to explain what happened 2 nights ago." I was sitting there in that chair, completely confused and trying to process what my mother had just asked me. "What do you mean?" I responded, genuinely having no idea what she was referring to. "Nothing happened 2 nights ago. I was home watching TV like I do most weeknights." That's when Victoria looked up at me with this expression that I will never forget as long as I live. It was a combination of pure terror and hurt, like I was some kind of dangerous monster who had just threatened her entire family. Through her tears and barely controlled sobbing, she started talking, and what came out of her mouth made my blood run absolutely cold. She claimed that on Monday night, the exact same night that she had texted me those inappropriate messages, I had supposedly contacted her asking to meet up. According to her completely fabricated story, I had told her that I needed to discuss something important about work and had somehow convinced her to come over to my apartment around 10:30 p.m. She went on to claim that when she arrived at my place, I seemed different and aggressive compared to how I normally acted at work. She said that I had offered her something to drink, and that after she consumed whatever I had given her, she started feeling dizzy and confused. Then, according to this absolute fantasy she was spinning, I had forced myself on her sexually. She claimed that I wouldn't take no for an answer, and that she was too messed up from whatever I had supposedly put in her drink to properly fight back or resist what was happening. I'm sitting there listening to this complete and utter insanity with my mouth literally hanging open, unable to comprehend how someone could fabricate such an elaborate and vicious lie. This was the exact same girl who had texted me just 2 nights earlier, confessing that she had romantic feelings for me and asking if we could meet up for coffee. And now she was sitting in my parents' living room, spinning this horrific tale about me drugging and sexually assaulting her. "Are you out of your mind?" I said, probably much louder than I should have given the tense atmosphere in the room. "Mom, Dad, you cannot seriously believe this ridiculous story." But the looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know about where their loyalties lay. They weren't looking at me like I was their son, who was being falsely accused of a horrible crime. Instead, they were looking at me like I was a dangerous predator who had just been caught red-handed and was now trying to lie his way out of the consequences. "Blake, this is very serious," my dad said in this cold, emotionless voice that I had never heard him use with me before in my entire life. "Victoria came to us because she didn't know what else to do or where else to turn for help." I tried desperately to explain to them about the text messages, how Victoria was the one who had initiated inappropriate contact with me, how I had firmly rejected her advances, and how she was now clearly lying in retaliation for that rejection. But every single time I opened my mouth to defend myself or explain what had really happened, Victoria would start crying even harder and more dramatically. "She's lying," I said, my voice rising with frustration and desperation. "Check my phone! Check her phone! She texted me first saying she liked me and wanted to meet up. I told her no because she's dating Dylan." But then my mother said something that made me realize just how hopeless this situation had become. Victims often blame themselves or misremember details when they're traumatized. It's common for them to think they did something to cause what happened to them. I suddenly realized that my own mother had been reading articles about sexual assault online, or something similar, and she was now using psychology arguments against me to justify believing this psychotic woman over her own son. It was like she had already made up her mind about my guilt and was working backward to rationalize that decision. That's when Dylan walked in from the kitchen area. He must have been listening to the entire conversation from the other room, because the second his eyes met mine, his face went completely dark with a kind of hatred and rage that I had never seen from him before, despite all our childhood conflicts and sibling rivalry over the years. "You sick piece of shit!" he said, and before I could even react or process what was happening, he was charging directly at me with violent intent. I tried to get up from the chair to defend myself, but Dylan was much faster than I anticipated. He tackled me with the full force of his body weight, and we both crashed to the floor, knocking over the coffee table in the process. The sound of furniture scraping and items scattering filled the room as we hit the ground hard. He managed to get on top of me and immediately started throwing punches with the kind of wild rage that comes from someone who genuinely believes they're defending an innocent victim. He got me good across the jaw with his first solid hit, and I felt the immediate sharp pain and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. Then he landed a couple of brutal shots to my ribs that completely knocked the wind out of me, leaving me gasping and struggling to breathe. I put my hands up trying to protect my face and vital areas, but Dylan was in full rage mode and seemed completely beyond reason. He's about 25 pounds heavier than me and had always been more dedicated to working out regularly, so I was pretty much completely screwed in this fight. I was basically just trying to survive the beating rather than fight back effectively. The whole time he was hitting me, he was screaming things like, "How could you do this to her?" and "You're absolutely disgusting," between each punch. His voice was filled with a kind of moral outrage and fury that would have been justified if his accusations were actually true. But hearing those words while getting beaten up for something I absolutely did not do was one of the most surreal and horrible experiences of my entire life. My dad finally stepped in and pulled Dylan off of me, but not before significant damage had been done. My lip was split and bleeding profusely. My nose was definitely bleeding and possibly broken, and I could already feel my left eye starting to swell up in a way that told me I was going to have a spectacular black eye. The taste of blood was overwhelming, and my ribs felt like they might be bruised or worse. Even after my father had physically restrained him, Dylan was still trying to get at me, calling me every horrible name in the book while struggling against my dad's grip. He was completely consumed with rage and seemed like he wanted to continue beating me until I was unconscious or worse. "That's enough," my mom yelled. But what really struck me was that she wasn't yelling at Dylan for viciously beating the shit out of me based on false accusations. She was yelling at both of us for fighting in her living room as if we had gotten into some kind of mutual scuffle rather than me being the victim of a one-sided assault. I struggled to my feet, feeling dizzy and disoriented from the beating. I was wiping blood from my nose with my sleeve and trying to assess the full extent of my injuries. Everything hurt, and I could feel that my face was already starting to swell in multiple places. I looked around at all of them. My parents, who had raised me for 23 years, my brother, who I had grown up with despite all our differences and conflicts, and this woman who was systematically destroying my life with her elaborate lies. Not a single one of them would even consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I was telling the truth about what had actually happened. "Get out!" my mom said, and her voice was like ice-cold steel. There was no warmth, no motherly concern for my obvious injuries, no doubt about the decision she was making. "Get out of this house and don't come back until you're ready to admit what you did and get professional help." "I didn't do anything," I said. But even as the words came out of my mouth, I could hear how desperate and pathetic I sounded. My voice was distorted from my split lip and the blood in my mouth, which only made me sound more guilty somehow. "Get out!" My dad roared with a volume and intensity that I had never heard from him before in my entire life. The man who had taught me how to ride a bike and had come to all my baseball games was now screaming at me to leave his house like I was some kind of dangerous stranger. So I left. I walked out of that house with blood still dripping from my nose, a rapidly blackening eye, and the growing realization that my entire family had just completely disowned me based on the word of a woman who had literally texted me 2 days earlier, trying to initiate an affair. I drove home with my vision partially obscured by the swelling around my eye, using napkins from my glove compartment to try to stop the bleeding from my nose. The whole drive back to my apartment, I kept thinking that surely this was all some kind of nightmare that I would wake up from. Surely my family would come to their senses and realize how insane this whole situation was. But when I finally made it back to my apartment that night, I sat there holding ice to my battered face and trying to process the fact that my parents and brother had chosen to believe a manipulative liar over their own flesh and blood. I kept telling myself that they would call, that someone would realize how crazy Victoria's story was, that someone would remember what kind of person I had always been. But my phone stayed completely silent. No calls, no texts, nothing. They had made their choice, and it wasn't me. Friday morning, I woke up looking like I had gone 10 rounds with Mike Tyson in a professional boxing match. My left eye was swollen almost completely shut, with deep purple and black bruising surrounding the entire socket. My lip looked like a sausage that had been inflated to twice its normal size, and I had these dark purple bruises running along my jawline that made me look like I had been in a serious car accident. I took some pictures of myself with my phone, thinking that maybe if my parents saw photographic evidence of how badly Dylan had beaten me up, they would feel guilty about what had happened and want to hear my side of the story. I was still desperately clinging to the hope that once they saw the extent of my injuries, they would realize that something was very wrong with this whole situation and reach out to me. I was completely wrong about that assumption, just like I had been wrong about everything else in this nightmare scenario. Around 1 p.m., my phone started ringing, and when I saw that it was my Aunt Jennifer, my mom's sister, I felt a brief moment of relief. I figured that maybe my mom had called her for advice about the situation, and that Jennifer would be the voice of reason that my family desperately needed. She had always been the most level-headed person in our extended family, and I thought surely she would see through Victoria's lies. "Blake, what is wrong with you?" she said the absolute second I picked up the phone. Her voice was filled with disgust and disappointment that hit me like a physical blow. "Your mother is absolutely devastated. How could you do something like this to that poor girl?" I tried to explain to her that I hadn't done anything wrong, that Victoria was lying about everything that had supposedly happened. But Jennifer cut me off before I could even get through my first sentence of explanation. "Don't you dare try to blame the victim," she said, with a level of anger that I had never heard from her before. "That poor girl is traumatized, and you're making it worse by continuing to deny what you did to her." She hung up on me before I could say another word in my defense. The conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes, and it was clear that my mother had already poisoned the entire extended family against me with Victoria's fabricated story. Then my Uncle Robert called, followed by my cousin Jessica, then my grandmother, and the pattern was exactly the same with every single conversation. They had already heard Victoria's version of events from my parents, and every one of them had decided that I was guilty without even bothering to hear my perspective on what had actually happened. Nobody wanted to hear my side of the story. Nobody asked for proof or evidence to support these serious accusations. Nobody seemed to remember what kind of person I had been my entire life up until this point. They had all simply accepted that their family member was a rapist and had moved on with that assumption as established fact. By Sunday evening, I had received calls from pretty much every relative I had in my extended family. The ones who didn't call were probably just avoiding me entirely, which was somehow even worse than the confrontational calls. I felt like I had been erased from the family tree overnight. My cousin Kevin was literally the only person who seemed even slightly skeptical about the entire situation. He called me Sunday night, and his tone was different from everyone else who had contacted me. "Dude, this doesn't sound like you at all," he said when we started talking. "I mean, you've always been the responsible one in the family. Why would you throw your entire life away for something like this?" Kevin had always been cool, and we were close in age, so we had hung out together a lot when we were growing up. He was also one of the few family members who had always seen through my parents' obvious favoritism toward Dylan and had called them out on it occasionally over the years. "Because I didn't do it," I told him with complete honesty. "She's lying, Kevin. She texted me first, trying to get me to cheat with her on Dylan. When I said no and rejected her, she made up this entire story as revenge." "Can you prove that?" he asked. "Like, do you still have the text messages or any evidence of what really happened?" I checked my phone and realized with growing horror that I had deleted the entire conversation after telling Victoria to never contact me again about her inappropriate feelings. At the time, I had just wanted the whole awkward situation to disappear, so I had erased all evidence of it from my phone. I deleted them, I admitted, feeling like an idiot for making such a crucial mistake. I was trying to pretend the whole thing never happened and just move on. Kevin was quiet for a long minute, and I could practically hear him thinking through the implications of what I had just told him. "That's not good, man," he finally said. "Without proof, it's just your word against hers, and she's got everyone's sympathy right now." He was absolutely right, and we both knew it. He said that he personally believed my version of events, but one person believing me didn't mean much when the other 20 people in my family had already decided that I was a monster who was capable of drugging and sexually assaulting someone. Monday morning, I dragged myself to work, hoping that things would at least be normal there, and that I could find some refuge from the family drama that was consuming my life. I had worn sunglasses to try to hide the black eye, but my manager took one look at me when I walked into the office and immediately asked what had happened to my face. "Family stuff," I said, which was technically true, even though it didn't begin to capture the scope of the disaster that my life had become. I managed to make it about 4 hours into the workday before everything went to hell there as well. Around 11 a.m., my manager Lisa called me into her office, and I could tell immediately from her body language that this wasn't going to be a routine check-in or work-related discussion. She looked really uncomfortable and was avoiding making direct eye contact with me, which was completely out of character for someone who was normally very straightforward and professional in all of her interactions. "Blake, we've received a complaint about you from another employee," she said, clearly struggling with how to approach this conversation. It's very serious." My stomach immediately dropped to the floor because I knew exactly what this was about. There was only one person who could have filed a complaint against me, and only one topic that would warrant this kind of uncomfortable conversation with my manager. "What kind of complaint?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer and was just hoping against hope that maybe I was wrong about what was happening. "I can't go into all the specific details because of HR policies," she said, "but it involves inappropriate conduct toward a female coworker. HR has reviewed the situation, and we've decided that it's best if you clear out your desk and leave the building today." The finality of that statement hit me like a punch to the gut. After 5 years at this company, with consistently good performance reviews, and never so much as a written warning for anything, I was being terminated based solely on Victoria's false allegations. "Lisa, you know me," I said, trying to appeal to our professional relationship and her knowledge of my character. "Do you really think I would do something like what I'm being accused of?" She finally looked me in the eyes, and I could see that she genuinely felt bad about this whole situation. There was conflict written all over her face, like she was being forced to do something that went against her better judgment. "It doesn't matter what I personally think, Blake," she said with obvious regret. "We have to take these allegations seriously, and the company has decided that this is the best course of action. I'm sorry." So that was it. 5 years of dedicated work, positive relationships with colleagues, and a clean professional record meant absolutely nothing. Victoria had filed a false report, and I was out the door without any kind of investigation, hearing, or chance to defend myself against her accusations. The company's policy was apparently to assume guilt first and ask questions never. The walk from Lisa's office to my desk was one of the most humiliating experiences of my entire life. Word had obviously spread throughout the office about what was happening, because people were staring at me and whispering to each other as I made my way across the floor. Some of my coworkers, who I had considered friends, suddenly found their computer screens absolutely fascinating whenever I walked by, unable or unwilling to make eye contact with me. I grabbed all of my personal belongings and threw them into a cardboard box that someone had provided for this exact purpose. Family photos, a few books, some personal office supplies, and a small plant that I had been taking care of for 3 years. My entire professional life reduced to one small box of items. The security guard escorted me out of the building like I was some kind of dangerous criminal who posed a threat to the other employees. 20 minutes earlier, I had been a valued member of the team with access to sensitive client information and important projects. Now I was being treated like a potential threat who needed to be removed from the premises as quickly as possible. The next few weeks were absolutely the lowest point of my entire life, both professionally and personally. I applied for probably 60 different jobs online and managed to get maybe 10 interviews from all of those applications. Every single interview followed the same devastating pattern. The potential employers would seem genuinely interested in my qualifications and experience at first. My resume was solid, I had good references from previous positions, and I interviewed well when I could get my foot in the door. But then they would call my most recent employer for a reference check, or they would do a background investigation, and suddenly the position would be filled by another candidate. News travels incredibly fast in our industry, especially when it involves dramatic situations like sexual assault allegations against employees. While I wasn't officially blacklisted from working anywhere, I might as well have been. Nobody wanted to hire the guy who had gotten fired from his previous job for supposedly forcing himself on a female coworker. My savings account was shrinking at an alarming rate as the weeks went by without any income. Rent, car payment, student loans, groceries, utilities, all the normal monthly expenses that I had never worried about before were now sources of constant stress. I had always been pretty good with managing my money and maintaining a reasonable emergency fund, but I wasn't prepared for the financial impact of sudden unemployment combined with the inability to find new work. I started doing gig work out of desperation. DoorDash, Uber, whatever I could find that didn't require extensive background checks or professional references. It was a huge step down from my previous career, but at least it provided some income to keep me afloat while I continued searching for something better. The isolation was almost worse than the financial stress that I was dealing with. I had always been somewhat of a loner by nature, but now I was completely cut off from everyone I cared about or had relationships with. My entire family had disowned me and wouldn't speak to me. My former coworkers thought I was a predator and wanted nothing to do with me. I had maybe 3 close friends outside of work, and even they seemed increasingly uncomfortable around me once they heard about what had supposedly happened. They didn't directly accuse me of anything, but I could tell that they were questioning whether they really knew me as well as they thought they did. I spent most of my days alone in my apartment, endlessly applying for jobs that would never call me back. Most nights I spent driving around the city delivering burgers and Chinese food to people, which was deeply depressing, but at least kept me busy and provided some small income. The worst moments were the quiet times when I would start thinking about how completely unfair everything was, and how one person's lies had systematically destroyed everything I had worked for in my adult life. Around week 5 of my unemployment, I got desperate enough to swallow my pride and call my parents. I wasn't looking for forgiveness or trying to convince them that I was innocent. At that point, I had given up hope that they would ever believe my version of events. I just needed to know if there was any possibility of getting my job back if Victoria ever admitted that she had made the whole thing up. My dad answered the phone on the 3rd ring, and his voice was cold and unwelcoming from the very first word. "What do you want, Blake?" he said, like I was some kind of annoying telemarketer who had interrupted his day. "Dad, I'm not asking you to believe me or forgive me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and reasonable. "But I need to know. If it ever came out that Victoria made the whole thing up, would you help me get my job back or give me a reference?" "She didn't make it up," he said with absolute certainty and zero hesitation. "Stop calling here until you're ready to take responsibility for what you did." He hung up on me before I could say another word, and I was left holding the phone in stunned silence. That brief conversation made me realize something that I'd been trying to avoid accepting. My parents weren't just temporarily angry with me or confused about the situation. They genuinely, completely believed that I was capable of drugging and sexually assaulting someone. My own parents thought I was a predator and a criminal. That realization hit me harder than any of Dylan's punches had during our fight. The people who had raised me, who had been there for every major milestone in my life, who supposedly knew me better than anyone else in the world, they truly believed I was capable of committing such a horrific act against another person. I was completely and utterly on my own. No family, no job, no real prospects for the future, and a reputation that would follow me everywhere I went in my professional field. At 23 years old, I had to somehow rebuild my entire life from scratch because some psychotic woman had decided to destroy me for rejecting her inappropriate advances. But you know what? Sometimes when you lose absolutely everything, you discover what you're really made of and what you're actually capable of achieving when your back is against the wall. After 2 months of delivering food for barely above minimum wage and getting rejected from every decent job opportunity that came my way, I realized that the normal career path wasn't going to work for me anymore. Not after Victoria had systematically wrecked my professional reputation and made me unemployable in the traditional corporate world. So I took a $13 an hour warehouse job at Metro Distribution, a logistics company that didn't require extensive background checks or detailed professional references. They just needed people who would show up on time and work hard, and they didn't ask too many questions about your past employment history. But I knew from day one that I couldn't do manual warehouse labor forever. I wasn't going to let Victoria's lies condemn me to a lifetime of minimum wage jobs and financial struggles. So after every exhausting shift at the warehouse, when I was physically drained and mentally exhausted, I would spend hours online teaching myself digital marketing skills. I studied Facebook advertising, copywriting, audience targeting, conversion optimization, anything and everything related to helping businesses reach customers through online channels. I figured that if small businesses didn't know how to effectively advertise their products or services online, I could be the guy who provided that expertise and helped them succeed. 7 months into this routine of working at the warehouse during the day and studying marketing at night, I finally landed my first freelance client. It was a small pizza place called Marco's, and the owner was struggling to bring in new customers despite having great food and reasonable prices. I ran a $250 Facebook advertising campaign for them that was carefully targeted to local customers who were likely to order pizza delivery. The campaign brought in over $1,800 in new revenue for Marco's within the first month, which was more than a 7x return on their advertising investment. Word started to spread within the local small business community about my results. More restaurant owners, retail shops, and service businesses started hiring me to help them with their online marketing efforts. They didn't care about my employment history or ask questions about why I had left my previous corporate job. They only cared about whether I could deliver results that improved their bottom line. By month 9 of this new venture, my freelance income was matching what I had been making at the warehouse. I finally felt confident enough to quit that job, opened a bare-bones office space, and officially launched Phoenix Digital Marketing as my own business. It was incredibly rough at first. Some weeks I was completely broke, other weeks I had decent income, but the inconsistency was nerve-wracking after being used to a steady corporate paycheck. But I stuck with it because I could see the potential for growth, and I was determined not to let Victoria's actions define the rest of my professional life. In year 2 of running Phoenix Digital Marketing, I was earning significantly more than I had ever made in my corporate job. I hired my first employee, then a small team, and eventually outgrew my initial office space. What had started as a desperate attempt to rebuild my career had turned into something much bigger and more successful than I had ever imagined possible. The crazy part was discovering how much I genuinely enjoyed entrepreneurship and building my own business. At my old corporate job, I had been analyzing other people's marketing campaigns and implementing strategies that someone else had developed. Now, every client's success was directly tied to my own work and creativity. When business owners would tell me that my campaigns had allowed them to hire new employees or achieve their best quarter ever, that feeling was absolutely incredible and rewarding in a way that corporate work had never been. By year 3 of running Phoenix Digital Marketing, I had expanded to 9 employees working in a real office space with actual conference rooms and professional amenities. I was making more money than I had ever imagined possible when I was working my corporate job, and more importantly, I was building something that was entirely mine. Every decision, every success, every failure, it all belonged to me, and there was something incredibly empowering about that level of control over my professional destiny. Throughout this entire time period when I was rebuilding my career and my life, I kept loose tabs on my family through social media and occasional updates from my cousin Kevin. Dylan was still working at his same job at Apex Marketing Solutions, still posting pictures of himself at parties and social events, seemingly living the exact same lifestyle he had always maintained. My parents appeared to be doing fine financially, probably still providing whatever support Dylan needed whenever he got into trouble or made poor decisions. None of them had any idea what I was building or how successful I had become in my new venture. They had no clue that the son and brother they had thrown away was now running a thriving business and making more money than any of them. And honestly, that was exactly how I wanted it. I had no desire to prove anything to them or seek their approval for what I had accomplished on my own. But around this time, something happened that would completely change everything and set me on a path toward getting the justice I had been waiting for all these years. I was at this networking event downtown, one of those professional mixers where local business owners and entrepreneurs gather to make connections and discuss potential collaborations. These events were usually pretty valuable for finding new clients, but this particular evening I was feeling bored and wondering if I should just leave early and go home. That's when I noticed this woman across the room who looked about as uninterested in the networking small talk as I felt. She was tall, brunette, probably in her early 30s, and had this confident, no-nonsense vibe about her that immediately caught my attention. While everyone else was engaged in the typical superficial networking conversations, she seemed to be observing the room with the analytical eye of someone who was used to reading people and situations. We ended up striking up a conversation, and I discovered that her name was Riley. She worked as a private investigator and forensic accountant, specializing in corporate fraud cases and financial crimes. She had this sharp intelligence and dry sense of humor that I found incredibly attractive, and we ended up talking for the rest of the evening about everything from business to books to travel experiences. We hit it off immediately in a way that felt completely natural and effortless. After years of isolation and focusing solely on rebuilding my career, it felt amazing to connect with someone who was intelligent, successful, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person. We started dating, and about 3 months into our relationship, Riley asked me a question that I had been dreading but knew would eventually come up. We were having dinner at her apartment one evening when she looked at me with that investigative curiosity that was such a big part of her personality. "Blake, I've noticed that you never mention your family," she said. "Are you guys not close? Or is there some kind of situation there that you don't want to talk about?" I usually just gave people a vague answer about how we weren't close and left it at that. Most people didn't push for details, and I had gotten pretty good at deflecting questions about my family situation. But Riley was different. She was trained to notice inconsistencies and gaps in people's stories, and she kept gently pushing for more information. Finally, one night when she brought up the topic again, I decided to tell her everything. The false accusation from Victoria, getting disowned by my family, losing my job, having to rebuild my entire life from nothing. The whole devastating story that I had never told anyone in complete detail. Most people, if I had told them this story, would probably think I was lying, or at least wonder if maybe some part of Victoria's accusations were actually true. People generally don't want to believe that innocent men can have their lives destroyed by false allegations because it's easier to assume that where there's smoke, there must be fire. Not Riley. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, asking clarifying questions here and there, but mostly just taking in all the details with the focused attention of someone who was used to analyzing complex situations for a living. When I finished telling her everything, she was quiet for a minute, and then she said something that gave me literal chills and made me realize that maybe, finally, someone was going to help me get the justice I deserved. "That girl sounds like a professional liar," Riley said with the confidence of someone who had seen similar patterns before. "I've encountered this type of behavior in fraud cases that I've worked on. People who make false accusations like this usually don't just do it once. It's learned behavior that they repeat whenever they need to manipulate a situation to their advantage." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a spark of hope for the first time in years. "If she screwed you over this badly and got away with it completely, I guarantee you that she's done similar things to other people too," Riley explained. "Want me to dig into her background and see what I can find? If there's dirt to uncover about this woman, I'll find it. That's what I do for a living." I wasn't sure at first whether I wanted to go down that path. Part of me had worked hard to move on from what had happened and focus on building my new life. But another part of me wanted justice, not just for myself, but for any other innocent men that Victoria might target in the future with her manipulative lies. So I told Riley yes, I wanted her to investigate Victoria's background and see what she could uncover. "Give me 4 weeks," she said, with the kind of professional confidence that told me she was very good at her job. "If Victoria's got skeletons in her closet, I'll find them." Those 4 weeks felt like they dragged on forever. Every day, I found myself wondering what Riley was discovering during her investigation, if she was finding anything significant at all. Part of me was worried that maybe Victoria really was just some troubled young woman who had made one terrible decision in a moment of rejection and revenge, and that I was about to waste time and money trying to prove something that didn't exist. But Riley seemed genuinely confident that there was more to Victoria's story than what appeared on the surface. She had that investigative instinct that comes from years of uncovering fraud and deception in corporate settings, and she seemed to believe that people who engage in this type of manipulative behavior rarely limit themselves to just one victim. Meanwhile, life was going incredibly well in every other aspect. My business kept growing at a steady pace, with new clients coming in through referrals and word-of-mouth recommendations. I was starting to feel like I had truly made it as an entrepreneur, building something successful and sustainable that could support me for years to come. But even as I was enjoying this professional success, I couldn't fully relax and appreciate what I had accomplished because there was always this nagging thought in the back of my mind about my family. It had been almost 4 years since they had thrown me out of their house and cut off all contact with me, and sometimes I would find myself wondering what they were doing with their lives. Did they ever think about me during family gatherings or holidays? Did they ever question whether they had made the right choice in believing Victoria over their own son? Had they moved on completely? Or was there some small part of them that occasionally wondered if maybe they had been wrong about what really happened that night? As it turned out, I was going to find out the answers to those questions much sooner than I expected, and in a way that would reveal just how shallow and opportunistic my family's motivations really were. One afternoon, I was sitting in my office reviewing quarterly campaign reports and analyzing client performance metrics when my assistant buzzed me on the intercom system. "Blake, there's a woman here to see you," she said. "She says she's your mother." My heart literally stopped beating for a moment. I hadn't spoken to my mom in almost 4 years, and suddenly she was showing up unannounced at my business office. This couldn't possibly be good news, and I immediately started running through all the possible scenarios for why she might be here after all this time. "Send her in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional, even though my mind was racing with anxiety and confusion. My mom walked into my office looking noticeably older than I remembered from our last encounter. There was more gray hair, deeper lines around her eyes, and a general weariness that suggested the past few years hadn't been particularly easy for her either. She was dressed nicely, though, like she was trying to make a good impression or had put extra effort into her appearance for this visit. She stood in the doorway for a few seconds, just staring at me with an expression that I couldn't quite read. I could see her taking in my office environment. The professional furniture, the framed client testimonials on the walls, the view from the windows, all the visible signs of business success. "Hi, Blake," she said quietly, with none of the warmth or familiarity that you'd expect from a mother greeting her son after years of separation. "Mom," I replied. I deliberately didn't get up from my desk or make any move to embrace her. "What are you doing here?" She continued looking around my office, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she processed the fact that I had obviously done well for myself financially and professionally despite being cut off from the family. "We need to talk," she said, still maintaining that careful, almost formal tone. "Can we go somewhere private where we can have a real conversation?" I almost laughed out loud at the irony of the situation. After 4 years of complete silence and rejection, now she suddenly wanted to have a real conversation with me. But I was curious about what had prompted this unexpected visit, so I agreed to go grab coffee at a place down the street from my office. We sat across from each other at a small table, and the awkward silence stretched on for several minutes before she finally worked up the courage to explain why she was there. "Your father and I have been doing some thinking," she began, using the kind of careful language that suggested she had rehearsed this conversation in advance. "We know that things ended badly between us, but family is family. We want to try to rebuild our relationship with you." I just stared at her, trying to process what she was saying and figure out what had really motivated this sudden change of heart after years of treating me like I didn't exist. "After 4 years?" I asked. "What exactly has changed that made you decide you want to rebuild our relationship now?" She got noticeably defensive when I questioned her timing. "Does it really matter why we're here now? The important thing is that we're trying to make things right between us. But something about the timing felt extremely suspicious to me. Why now, after all this time? Why today specifically?" Then I remembered my cousin Kevin mentioning something about Dylan having some kind of financial problems recently, and I decided to test a theory that was forming in my mind. "How's Dylan doing these days?" I asked, watching her facial expression carefully for any tells or reactions. Her face changed slightly when I brought up my brother, and I could see that I had hit on something significant. "He's going through a rough patch right now," she admitted. "He made some bad investments recently, but that's not why we're here today." But that was exactly why they were here, and I could see it written all over her face. They had found out that I was financially successful, and suddenly they wanted to reconcile. Not because they missed me or realized they had made a terrible mistake, but because they needed money to help Dylan out of whatever mess he had gotten himself into. "What kind of bad investments?" I pressed, wanting to get more details about what was really going on. "Blake, let's focus on us and our relationship," she said, trying to redirect the conversation away from Dylan's problems. "We want you to come to dinner this weekend. Your father really wants to see you." I felt this cold anger building up inside me as I realized exactly what was happening. These people had thrown me away like garbage based on the lies of a manipulative woman. They hadn't contacted me once in 4 years, hadn't shown any interest in my well-being or success, and had made it clear that I was dead to them. And now they wanted to play happy family because their golden child was in financial trouble, and they thought I might be able to help. "No," I said simply and firmly. "What do you mean, no?" she asked, clearly not expecting such a direct rejection of her olive branch. "You made your choices 4 years ago," I said, cutting her off before she could continue with whatever manipulative speech she had planned. "And now, you have to live with the consequences of those choices." I started to get up to leave, but she grabbed my arm in a desperate attempt to keep me at the table. "Blake, please," she said, and now the desperation was becoming obvious in her voice. "Dylan really needs help. He owes some dangerous people money." And there it was. The real reason for this sudden family reunion. It wasn't about love or forgiveness or realizing they had been wrong about me. It was about money and getting me to bail Dylan out of whatever stupid situation he had created for himself. I pulled my arm away from her grip and stood up from the table. "That's not my problem," I said coldly. "You chose him over me, remember? Now you can deal with the consequences." I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her sitting there crying, but I wasn't done with this situation yet. When I got back to my office after that disastrous coffee meeting with my mother, The first thing I did was call my cousin Kevin to get the real story about what was happening with Dylan's financial situation. Dude, what's really going on with Dylan? I asked him directly. My mom just showed up at my office trying to reconcile, and I know there's more to this story. Kevin let out a long sigh before responding, which told me that the situation was probably even worse than I had suspected. It's really bad, man, he said. Dylan got involved in some cryptocurrency scheme that turned out to be a complete scam. He lost about $35,000 of his own money, which was basically his entire savings account. But that's not even the worst part. He also convinced several of his friends to invest their money in this thing, and now they're absolutely furious with him because they lost everything too. The story got even worse from there. After losing all that money in the crypto scam, Dylan had apparently tried to make it back through some kind of day trading scheme that he had no experience or knowledge about. Instead of recovering his losses, he had managed to lose even more money, digging himself deeper into debt. Apparently, he's in the hole for around $90,000 total, Kevin continued. Part of that is credit cards and personal loans from banks, which is bad enough. But the rest of it, that's the kind of debt that doesn't come with late fees and payment plans. It comes with threats and people who don't exactly believe in legal collection methods, if you know what I mean. So Dylan had finally managed to completely destroy his own life through his own stupidity and poor decision-making. And now, my parents wanted me to bail him out of the consequences of his actions. The irony was absolutely incredible, considering how they had treated me when I was the one who needed their support and belief in my innocence. That evening, Riley called me with an update on her investigation into Victoria's background, and her timing couldn't have been more perfect. "I found something big," she said, and I could hear the excitement and satisfaction in her voice. "Can you come over to my apartment? This is definitely something you need to see in person." I drove over to Riley's place immediately, and when I walked into her apartment, I was amazed by what I saw. She had files and documents spread all over her dining room table. Printouts, timelines, photographs, official records. It looked like she was investigating a murder case rather than just doing background research on one person. "Sit down," she said, with the kind of serious expression that told me I was about to learn something that would change everything. "This is going to be a lot to process, and I want to make sure you're prepared for what I'm about to show you." She started by laying out Victoria's employment history, which was much more extensive than I had realized. It turned out that she had worked at 4 different companies before joining our firm at Apex Marketing Solutions. Not just the 2 previous jobs that I had known about from her resume. "Now look at this pattern," Riley said, showing me a detailed timeline that she had constructed. At every single company where she worked, she accused male coworkers of harassment or sexual assault. Every single job, Blake. This wasn't a one-time thing with you. This was her standard operating procedure. The pattern was absolutely shocking when laid out chronologically. Victoria would start at a company and work there for approximately 14 to 20 months. Then, right around the time that performance reviews were happening or when there were rumors about potential layoffs, she would make an accusation against a male colleague. The targeted men would get fired immediately, while Victoria would receive sympathy from management and job security. But that wasn't even the most damaging thing that Riley had discovered during her investigation. "Look at this," Riley said, pulling out another folder filled with financial documents. "Victoria was embezzling money from your old company the entire time she worked there. She started small at first, just a few $100s here and there, but it escalated significantly over time. By the end, she had stolen almost $60,000 over the course of 2 years. Riley explained that the sexual assault accusations were essentially Victoria's insurance policy against getting caught. Every time someone in the accounting or finance department got close to discovering the financial fraud she was committing, she would cry harassment and point suspicion toward innocent men. It was the perfect distraction technique that kept people focused on the manufactured drama instead of looking at her financial crimes. "But wait, there's even more," Riley said, pulling out yet another folder of evidence. "Remember how Victoria always seemed to have expensive clothes and went on costly trips, despite working an entry-level HR position? It turned out that Victoria was running an extensive adult content business on the side. OnlyFans, escort websites, private cam shows. She was using company equipment and company time to run what was essentially a prostitution operation. And even worse, she was filming content in the office building after hours, using company property as the backdrop for her illegal business activities. Riley had found dozens of photos and videos that were clearly taken in our old office building. Conference rooms, private offices, even the break room where Victoria used to corner me for those uncomfortable conversations. She had been using all of these spaces to create pornographic content for her side business. She was basically running a prostitution ring out of the HR department, Riley said with disgust, using company resources, company time, and company property to facilitate illegal activities. I sat there staring at all the evidence spread across Riley's dining room table, feeling this incredible mixture of vindication and pure rage. This woman hadn't just lied about me to cover her tracks. She was a professional criminal who had been systematically destroying innocent men's lives for years to cover up her own crimes and protect her illegal business ventures. What do we do with all of this? I asked, still trying to process the scope of Victoria's criminal activities. Riley looked at me with a smile, but it wasn't a pleasant or friendly expression. It was the kind of predatory smile that a hunter gets when they finally corner their prey after a long chase. Now we completely destroy her, she said with cold satisfaction. Riley and I spent the next week putting together what she called the nuclear option. It was like building a legal atomic bomb designed to completely obliterate Victoria's life and ensure that she would never be able to hurt another innocent person again. We need to approach this systematically, Riley explained, as we organized all the evidence into different categories. We go to the police first and get the criminal charges filed. Then we hit the civil side, your old company, the IRS, state licensing boards, everyone who has jurisdiction over her various crimes. By the time we're finished with her, she'll be radioactive. No one will want to associate with her professionally or personally. The police detective we met with was this older, experienced guy who specialized in white-collar crime and fraud cases. He had seen it all during his career, but even he seemed particularly interested in Victoria's pattern of false accusations combined with financial crimes. "This is exactly the kind of case that makes my job worthwhile," he told us after reviewing all of Riley's evidence. Someone who uses false sexual assault allegations to cover up embezzlement is destroying lives on multiple levels. We're going to make sure she faces the full consequences of her actions. Within 72 hours of our meeting, the detective had arrest warrants prepared for Victoria on multiple charges. The authorities decided to arrest her at work for maximum impact, which I thought was absolutely perfect given how she had destroyed my career in that same office building. Riley and I weren't there to witness the arrest personally, but word spread incredibly fast through our old industry network about what had happened. The story was too dramatic and shocking for people to keep quiet about it. Apparently, Victoria was in the middle of a meeting with senior management, probably discussing some new policy or procedure, when 3 detectives walked directly into the conference room. She tried to play it off casually at first, asking what this was about and whether there had been some kind of mistake. But when the lead detective started reading her the charges, her face went completely white. The list was extensive and damning: embezzlement, fraud, filing false police reports, tax evasion, operating an illegal business, using company property for personal gain. The charges just kept coming. They handcuffed her right there in front of her boss and all of her coworkers, treating her exactly like the criminal she had always been. Someone in the meeting filmed the entire arrest on their phone, and within hours, the video was circulating all over social media and professional networks. Victoria wasn't just fired from her job, she got completely nuked. Her entire professional and personal life imploded in the span of a single afternoon. After she was exposed and arrested, our old company launched their own internal investigation to determine the full scope of the damage she had caused. What they uncovered was even worse than what Riley had initially discovered. Victoria had been selling confidential client information to competitors, falsifying HR records to cover her criminal tracks, and using company credit cards for personal expenses. The total financial damage to the company was around $240,000, which was far more than anyone had initially suspected. She had been systematically looting the business for years while hiding behind false accusations and manufactured workplace drama. Then the IRS stepped in and absolutely demolished her with 6 figures worth of back taxes and penalties from her illegal side business. She had never reported any of the income from her adult content operation, thinking that she could hide it forever. The tax liability alone was enough to financially destroy her, even without the criminal charges. The state licensing board got involved next and permanently revoked all of her HR certifications and professional credentials. She would never be allowed to work in human resources again, anywhere in the country. Her entire career path was completely eliminated. Within just 3 weeks of the initial arrest, Victoria's entire life had completely imploded. She lost her job, her professional certifications, her apartment when the news broke, and her landlord discovered what kind of tenant he was dealing with. She had to move back in with her parents like a disgraced teenager while facing multiple felony charges that could send her to prison for years. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for about a month after the arrest, and Riley and I made sure to be there to watch this woman who had destroyed my life finally face real consequences for her actions. Victoria looked absolutely terrible when she appeared in court. She had clearly lost weight, her hair was unkempt, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone whose world had completely fallen apart. Her attorney tried to argue that she was actually the real victim in this situation, claiming that this was all some kind of elaborate conspiracy against her because she had reported sexual assault. But the evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable. Multiple victims from different companies, clear financial records showing systematic theft, video evidence of her illegal business activities. There was simply no defense that could explain away this mountain of proof. Rather than risk going to trial and potentially facing decades in prison, Victoria ended up taking a plea deal. 4 years in state prison, plus full restitution to everyone she had stolen from over the years. Her criminal record would be permanently established, ensuring that she would never be able to work in any professional capacity again. She would spend the next 4 years of her life in a prison cell, thinking about how her own greed and willingness to destroy innocent people had ultimately led to her complete downfall. But here's the part that really shocked me. Even after all of this came out publicly, even after Victoria's arrest made headlines in our local business community, my family still didn't reach out to apologize or acknowledge that they had been wrong about me. I had figured that once the news broke and everyone knew the truth about Victoria's criminal activities and pattern of false accusations, I would get some kind of phone call or message from my parents. Some acknowledgement that they had made a terrible mistake in believing her over their own son. Nothing. Complete silence, just like it had been for the past 4 years. It wasn't until 4 months after Victoria's conviction that my family finally showed up at my doorstep. But as I would soon discover, their motivations were just as selfish and opportunistic as I had suspected. I was at home on a Saturday morning, enjoying a rare day off from work and just relaxing in my apartment, when I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple cars pulling into my driveway. I looked out the window and saw both of my parents climbing out of one vehicle while Dylan was getting out of a separate car. The fact that they had driven separately told me that this wasn't a spontaneous family visit. This was a coordinated effort that they had planned in advance. I almost didn't answer the door when they knocked. After 4 years of complete silence, followed by 4 months of continued silence, even after Victoria's conviction proved my innocence, I wasn't particularly interested in whatever they had to say. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to hear what possible justification they could offer for their years of treating me like I didn't exist. My dad was the first one to speak when I opened the door, and I could see that he was struggling with how to begin this conversation. "Blake, we owe you an apology," he said, using the kind of formal language that suggested he had rehearsed these words multiple times. "We saw the news about Victoria and everything that came out during her trial. We realized that we made a terrible mistake." I stared at him for a moment, processing what he had just said and feeling a familiar anger building up inside me. "A mistake?" I repeated. "You didn't make a mistake, Dad. You made a deliberate choice. You chose to believe her over me without asking a single question or giving me any benefit of the doubt whatsoever." My mom stepped forward, and I could see that she was already starting to cry again, just like she had during that coffee meeting months earlier. "We're sorry, Blake," she said through her tears. "We should have trusted you from the beginning. We want to make this right between us and rebuild our family relationship." Dylan stepped forward next, looking like he had aged 10 years since the last time I had seen him. The confident, arrogant guy who had beaten me up in my parents' living room was gone, replaced by someone who looked defeated and worn down by life. "Bro, I can't believe what I did to you," he said, and I could hear genuine remorse in his voice. "I beat you up for defending yourself against a criminal. I've been carrying this guilt around for years, knowing what I did to my own brother." "Have you, though?" I asked, cutting through his emotional speech. "Because none of you contacted me when the truth came out 4 months ago. You're only here now because you need something from me." The looks on their faces told me that I had hit the nail on the head. This wasn't about making amends or family reconciliation. This was about Dylan's financial problems and my newfound success. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice completely calm and controlled. "You're going to leave my property right now, and you're never going to come back. You're going to tell everyone that I don't exist." If you're at a family gathering and someone asks about me, you're going to say that you only have one son. Blake, please! My mom begged, reaching out toward me like she was going to try to grab my arm again. We're still family despite everything that's happened. Dylan tried to play the brother card, appealing to some sense of family loyalty that they had destroyed years earlier. Come on, man. I know I messed up badly, but we're still brothers. Blood is thicker than water, right? I looked at all three of them standing on my doorstep. These people who had thrown me away based on the lies of a criminal, who had refused to believe in my character despite knowing me my entire life, who had maintained their silence even when the truth was publicly revealed. They had made their choice years ago, and now they expected me to forget about it because they suddenly needed my help. I started walking back toward my house without saying another word to any of them. When I reached my front door, I turned around one last time to look at them. You made your choice when you believed a criminal over your own son, I said. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of your lives. I went inside and slammed the door behind me, then watched through the window as they stood there in my driveway for several minutes, probably trying to figure out if there was anything else they could say or do to change my mind. Eventually, they realized that I was serious about cutting them out of my life permanently, and they finally got back in their cars and left. That was 10 months ago, and I haven't heard from any of them since that final confrontation. My business is doing better than ever, with more clients and higher revenue than I ever thought possible when I first started Phoenix Digital Marketing. Riley and I got engaged 6 months ago, and we're planning a wedding for next year with the people who actually matter in our lives. As for my parents and Dylan, the last update I heard through my cousin Kevin painted a pretty grim picture of how their lives have turned out. They ended up having to sell the family house to pay off some of Dylan's massive debts to those dangerous people he had borrowed money from. My dad, who had been enjoying his retirement, was forced to come out of retirement and take a job to help cover their living expenses. My mom had to take a part-time retail job for the first time in decades. Dylan himself is now 25 years old and living in his parents' basement, working at some dead-end retail job because his reputation in the professional world is completely shot. Word got around about his financial irresponsibility and the drama surrounding our family situation, making him essentially unemployable in any serious career. They made their choice 4 years ago when they decided to believe a criminal over their own son and brother. They chose to throw me away based on lies, and they chose to maintain that decision even when the truth came to light. Now, they get to live with the consequences of those choices while I build a successful life with people who actually believe in me and support me. The irony is perfect. They destroyed their relationship with the son who would have succeeded and could have helped them, all to protect the son who ended up destroying himself through his own poor decisions. Justice served.